In the depths of winter, when iron becomes as brittle as bone and forge fires struggle against the merciless cold, the blacksmiths of medieval Europe faced a danger more insidious than any sword they crafted. Hello, dear friend. As you settle into the comfort of your bed tonight, let me take you back through the centuries to a time when the world moved slower, when darkness fell heavier, and when the simple act of working with one's hands could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let us journey together to a small village in the year 1347, where a young blacksmith named Thomas is about to learn the cruel lessons that winter teaches those who work with fire and metal. Thomas was 19 years old that November when the first serious frost came to the village of Ashford, nestled in the rolling hills of what we now call Yorkshire. He had been apprenticed to Master Edwin, the village blacksmith, since he was 12, and in those 7 years he had learned the secrets of transforming raw iron into the tools that kept the village alive. His hands, once soft as any boy's, had become calloused and strong, marked with the tiny white scars that were the signature of his trade. Each scar told a story, a moment when a spark had leaped too far, when a hammer had struck wrong, when hot metal had kissed his skin in passing. These were the badges of his profession, and he wore them with quiet pride. The forge stood at the edge of the village, a sturdy stone building with a thatched roof blackened by years of smoke. Inside, the great stone furnace dominated the space, its mouth like a cave opening into the heart of fire itself. The bellows hung beside it, their leather sides worn smooth by countless hands pumping air into the flames. Along the walls hung the tools of the trade, hammers of every size and weight, tongs with jaws shaped for gripping different forms of hot metal, chisels, punches, and files. The anvil, that sacred altar of the blacksmith's art, stood in the center of the workspace, its surface polished bright by the strike of 10,000 hammers. The floor was packed earth, stained black with coal dust and scattered with the curled shavings of metal that fell like iron snow whenever they shaped a piece. Thomas had risen before dawn that morning, as he did every morning except Sundays and feast days. The darkness of November was profound, thick and cold as black water. He had fumbled his way from the small room he rented above the baker's shop, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His fingers were already stiff as he walked the narrow lane toward the forge, and he tucked them under his armpits, trying to preserve what warmth he could. The village was silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the shuffling of livestock in their pens. Most people were still abed, huddled under whatever blankets and furs they possessed, stealing what warmth they could before the day's labor called them forth. The first task of every morning was lighting the forge, and in winter this became a test of patience and skill. The coal had to be arranged just so, with kindling beneath and careful spaces for air to flow. Thomas had learned to prepare the fire the night before, banking it carefully so that embers might survive until morning. When it worked, he could coax those sleeping coals back to life with gentle breaths and patient feeding of small fuel. When it failed, as it often did on the coldest nights, he had to start fresh, striking spark after spark from flint and steel into a nest of dry moss and wood shavings, nursing the tiny flame as tenderly as a newborn lamb. This morning the embers had died. Thomas knelt before the cold forge, his joints protesting the chill, and began the laborious process of making fire. His hands trembled slightly, making the work harder. Strike, strike, strike. The flint was cold against his palm, the steel striker clumsy in his stiff fingers. Finally, a spark caught, and a thin thread of smoke rose from the moss. He bent close, cupping his hands around it, breathing gently, so gently, feeding it air without smothering it. The flame grew, tentative as hope, and he added the thinnest shavings of wood, then slightly larger pieces, building slowly, always slowly, until at last he could add the kindling proper. Master Edwin arrived as the first real flames were climbing through the coal. He was a man of perhaps 45, though the hard years made him look older. His beard was shot through with gray, and his hands, those magnificent hands that could shape iron as though it were clay, were gnarled and twisted in a way that Thomas tried not to think about too much. 2 fingers on the left hand were missing entirely, taken years ago in an accident Edwin never spoke of. The remaining fingers were bent oddly, and on cold mornings like this, Thomas noticed how Edwin would flex them carefully, wincing, trying to work stiffness and pain out of the joints before the day's work began. "Good lad," Edwin said, his voice rough as gravel. "Fire's coming along nicely." He moved to the bellows and began to pump, his breathing steady and rhythmic. The coals brightened from red to orange to yellow-white, and heat began to radiate outward in waves. Thomas stepped closer, holding his hands toward the warmth, feeling the ache in his fingers begin to ease. They had orders to fill. There were always orders to fill. Winter was coming in earnest, and every farmer needed tools repaired before the ground froze completely. Plowshares to sharpen, blades to mend, hinges for barn doors, nails by the hundred, chains for hanging pots over fires, hooks for hanging meat in smoke houses. The list seemed endless, and each item represented not just work but survival. A broken tool in winter could mean the difference between eating and starving, between warmth and freezing. The blacksmith was not merely a craftsman but a guardian, a keeper of the implements that held death at bay. The first piece they worked that morning was a simple hoe blade that had cracked. The farmer who brought it had looked worried, his face drawn with the peculiar anxiety of a man who sees disaster lurking. "Can you mend it, Master Edwin?" he had asked, turning his cap in his hands. "I've 3 more fields to break before the freeze, and without this blade—" He had not finished the sentence. He had not needed to. Edwin had examined the crack, running his twisted fingers along it, and nodded. "We'll mend it. Have it for you tomorrow afternoon." Now that blade sat in the coals, heating toward the yellow-white temperature needed for forge welding. Thomas watched it carefully. This was one of the skills that separated a true blacksmith from a mere hammerer of metal. The heat had to be exactly right. Too cool and the weld would not take, would fail when the farmer put his weight behind it and the blade encountered a stone or root. Too hot and the metal would burn, becoming crumbly and weak, useless. The right heat was a color, a particular shade of yellow-white that glowed like a small sun, but it was also a feeling, a knowledge that came not from books but from watching and doing and failing and trying again. "Now," Edwin said quietly, and Thomas used the long tongs to lift the blade from the coals. They moved together in the dance they had practiced 1,000 times. Edwin positioned the blade on the anvil, holding it steady with his own tongs. Thomas raised the hammer, not the largest but a good solid 5-pound hammer, and brought it down with controlled force. The impact sang out, a clear ringing note, and sparks flew in a bright cascade. Again. The rhythm was everything. Too fast and the metal would cool before the weld was complete. Too slow and it would cool anyway. The hammer had to fall with metronomic precision, each blow driving the heated metal into itself, forcing the crack closed, welding the broken edges back together into a single unified piece. Sweat began to form on Thomas's forehead, despite the cold that still ruled the edges of the forge. His shoulders burned with effort. The hammer rose and fell, and the metal yielded, transforming under their combined will from broken to whole. Finally, Edwin nodded and pulled the blade from the anvil, plunging it into the slack tub, the barrel of water kept for cooling worked metal. Steam exploded upward with a violent hiss, and the water roiled as the heat transferred from metal to liquid. They examined the blade together. The weld was clean, the line barely visible. Edwin ran his thumb along it, feeling for any irregularity, then nodded with satisfaction. "Good work, lad. That'll hold him through the winter and beyond." The morning passed in this fashion, each task demanding its own particular attention. They made nails, dozens of them, heating wrought iron until it glowed, cutting it to length with a hardy chisel positioned in the hardy hole of the anvil, hammering the end flat into a head, then driving the shaft through a nail header to form the point. It was repetitive work, almost meditative, and Thomas found his mind drifting as his hands moved through the familiar motions. He thought about his family, his mother and father and 3 younger sisters, living in a village 2 days' walk to the south. He had not seen them in over a year. He sent money when he could, small sums carefully saved from the pennies Edwin paid him. His father was a cotter, working land he did not own, and the family survived on thin margins. Thomas's apprenticeship had been a stroke of fortune, arranged through a cousin who knew someone who knew Edwin. It meant 1 less month for his parents to feed, and eventually, when his apprenticeship was complete, it would mean a real income, a trade that could support a family. He thought about Agnes, the baker's daughter, who lived in the same house where he rented his small room. She was 17, with dark hair she wore in a long braid and eyes that reminded him of the honey her father sometimes used in his special feast day breads. They had spoken a few times, brief exchanges in the hallway or on the stairs, and Thomas had felt his heart perform strange acrobatics in his chest during those conversations. He was fairly certain she smiled at him more than politeness required, but he was not sure. He was never sure. Young men like him, Apprentices with no property and uncertain futures did not presume too much. By midday, the forge was wonderfully warm, almost hot, and Thomas had stripped down to his undershirt despite the cold air. His face was smudged with soot, his hair damp with sweat. They stopped to eat the simple meal Thomas had brought: bread, hard cheese, and an onion. Edwin produced a jug of weak ale, and they shared it, sitting on the bench outside the forge door, looking out at the village. Snow was beginning to fall, the first real snow of the season. The flakes were small and dry, dancing in the wind, settling on the thatched roofs and packed earth of the lanes. Thomas watched them accumulate, feeling a mix of wonder and unease. Snow was beautiful, but it was also a harbinger. Winter in these lands was not a gentle thing. It was a grinding test of endurance, a season when the weak and the unlucky died, when children and old people simply went to sleep one cold night and did not wake. The village would contract, turning inward, each household becoming an island trying to preserve warmth and food until spring released them. "You're thinking dark thoughts," Edwin observed, tearing off a piece of bread with his teeth. Thomas shrugged. "Just watching the snow." Edwin was quiet for a moment, chewing slowly. Then he said, "I was about your age when I lost these." He held up his left hand, wiggling the remaining fingers, the stumps of the lost ones. 21, I think. Maybe 22. A long time ago now. Thomas had never heard Edwin speak of it. He held still, afraid that any movement might stop the story. "It was a winter much like this one," Edwin continued, his voice distant. "I was working alone, which was my first mistake. The master had gone to another village to deliver a commission. I was working on a sword blade commission for a knight's son, and I was eager to prove myself. Too eager." He paused, taking a drink of ale. "The metal was hot, yellow hot, perfect for shaping. But my hands were cold. I had not warmed them properly before starting. I did not notice how stiff they were, how slow to respond. I gripped the tongs, positioned the blade, raised my hammer." He stopped, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to shape. "The tongs slipped. Just a little, just enough. The blade fell and I tried to catch it. Instinct, you understand. A stupid instinct." Thomas could picture it too clearly. Hot metal falling, hands reaching without thought, the terrible moment of contact. "The blade landed across these two fingers," Edwin said, indicating the missing digits. "Burned through skin and flesh to the bone in a heartbeat. The pain, well, I have no words for the pain. I plunged my hand into the slack tub, but the damage was done. By evening the flesh was black, by morning it stank. The barber surgeon took the fingers 3 days later, said I was lucky it had not spread further, that I had not lost the whole hand or died of the corruption that eats burned flesh." They sat in silence, the snow falling around them, the warmth of the forge at their backs contrasting with the cold air on their faces. "Why are you telling me this now?" Thomas asked quietly. Edwin looked at him directly, his eyes serious. "Because winter makes us careless, lad. We think we can push through the cold, Work through numb fingers, ignore the warning signs. But the forge does not care about our discomfort. Hot metal does not negotiate. You must respect your limits, especially in winter. Warm your hands before you work. If they are too cold, too stiff, stop. Wait. It is better to work slower and keep all your fingers than to work fast and lose them. He flexed his damaged hand, the twisted fingers moving stiffly. I was lucky in a way. I kept enough to continue working. Many do not. The afternoon brought new challenges. A merchant came with a special commission, decorative ironwork for a door, a pattern of leaves and vines that would show his wealth and status. It was delicate work, requiring careful heating and precise hammer control to coax the flat bar iron into curves and tapers. Thomas watched as Edwin worked, marveling at how those damaged hands could still produce such beauty. Each leaf was shaped individually, the metal drawn out and thinned at the edges, then carefully textured with a special hammer that had patterns carved into its face. The vine itself curved naturally, seeming to grow across the surface like a living thing. "You try one," Edwin said, stepping back from the anvil. Thomas's heart quickened. This was trust, genuine trust. Decorative work was the highest art of the blacksmith, the thing that separated craftsmen from artists. He selected a piece of bar iron, examined it carefully, then placed it in the coals. While it heated, he tried to envision the leaf he wanted to create, seeing it in his mind as if it already existed. When the iron reached working temperature, he removed it and began. The hammer felt good in his hand, familiar and true. He started the taper, working from the center outward, thinning the metal, giving it the shape of a leaf. It was harder than it looked. The metal wanted to curve in ways he did not intend. The heat faded quickly, forcing him to return the piece to the forge and reheat it. Again he worked, adjusting, refining. The leaves began to emerge. He textured it with careful strikes, creating the illusion of veins. It was not perfect, not as perfect as Edwin's work, but it was recognizably a leaf, and it had a certain crude vitality. Edwin examined it carefully, turning it in his hands. "Good," he said at last. "Very good for a first attempt. You have the eye for it. Now make 20 more, and by the end you will have the hand for it as well." Thomas felt a warm glow of pride that had nothing to do with the forge heat. He spent the rest of the afternoon making leaves, each one teaching him something new. His hands moved with increasing confidence, learning the feel of the work, the way the metal responded to different angles and forces. By the time the light began to fail, he had a small pile of metal leaves, and while none of them were perfect, they were all recognizable, all serviceable. As they banked the forge for the night, Edwin said, "You will be a good smith, Thomas. You have patience, and you are willing to learn. Those qualities are rarer than you might think." They parted in the gathering darkness, Edwin walking toward his small house on the north side of the village, Thomas heading back to his room above the bakery. The snow had continued throughout the afternoon, and now lay in a thin white blanket over everything, transforming the familiar into something strange and beautiful. Thomas walked slowly, in no hurry to leave the enchanted quality of the evening. His body ached pleasantly from the day's labor, his hands tired but satisfied. The bakery was warm, filled with the smell of tomorrow's bread already rising. Thomas climbed the narrow stairs to his room, a small space under the eaves with barely enough room for a straw mattress, a small chest for his few possessions, and a stool. A single small window looked out over the lane. It was cold in the room. Heat from the ovens below rose only weakly this far. Thomas wrapped himself in his blanket, a rough wool thing that scratched but held warmth, and lay down. He thought about Edwin's warning, about cold hands and falling blades. He looked at his own hands in the dim light from the window. They were young hands still, despite the calluses and scars. All the fingers were intact, strong and flexible. He tried to imagine losing two of them, tried to imagine the moment of searing pain and the long recovery. He failed. It was too foreign, too terrible to truly grasp. Sleep came slowly. The wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves, and he could hear the snow ticking against the window. Somewhere in the village a baby cried, the thin wail carrying in the cold air. A dog barked, the usual night sounds of the village, muffled and made strange by the snow. Thomas pulled the blanket tighter and closed his eyes. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm, shaped by winter's demands. Each morning, the same struggle to light the forge. Each day, the same parade of items needing repair or creation. Plowshares and hinges, nails and hooks, pot chains and door handles. The work was endless because the needs were endless, and behind every item was a person whose survival might depend on it functioning properly. Thomas began to understand something about his trade that had not been apparent before. Yes, the blacksmith worked with fire and metal. Yes, the work required strength and skill and patience. But more than that, the blacksmith was a guardian standing between the community and chaos. Every tool he made or mended was a small victory against entropy, against the natural tendency of things to break down and fall apart. The forge was not just a workplace but a fortress, and every item that came out of it was a weapon against the cold and dark and hunger that waited outside. The cold deepened as November became December. Ice formed thick on the water troughs, so thick that it had to be broken with hammers each morning. The packed earth of the lanes became hard as stone, and walking on it jarred the bones. People moved more slowly, conserving energy, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned. The very old and very young began to disappear from the streets, kept inside near fires, their families hoping they would survive to see spring. Thomas's hands began to trouble him. The cold seemed to penetrate deeper each day, making his fingers stiff and slow to respond. He followed Edwin's advice, warming them carefully before beginning work, but even so, he noticed changes. His grip was not quite as sure. Sometimes his fingers would not quite do what he intended, moving a fraction too slow or too fast. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, but it worried him. One morning in mid-December, they were working on a commission that required particular precision. a lock mechanism for a wealthy merchant's strongbox. Lock-making was one of the blacksmith's most challenging tasks, requiring components that fit together with almost no tolerance for error. The springs had to have exactly the right tension, the bolt had to slide smoothly, the key had to engage the tumblers perfectly. Edwin was doing most of the work, but Thomas was helping with the simpler components. He was shaping a small lever, a piece about as long as his thumb, that would engage with the bolt. It required careful heating and careful hammering, creating a specific curve and thickness. He had heated it properly, his eyes reading the color automatically now after years of practice. He positioned it on the anvil, gripped it with the small tongs they used for detail work, and raised his hammer. The first blow fell true, the second as well. On the third, something went wrong. His hand, his grip, the tongs, something. The piece shifted, just slightly, just enough. His hammer, already falling, struck not the workpiece but the tip of the tongs. The impact traveled up through the steel, through the handles, into his left hand where he gripped the tongs. The shock was immediate and intense, a jolt that felt like it traveled from his fingers all the way to his shoulder. He dropped the tongs with a cry, stepping back. The workpiece clattered to the floor. Edwin was beside him instantly. "Let me see." Thomas held out his hand. It was shaking, trembling like a bird. His fingers looked normal, no blood, no obvious damage, but the sensation was wrong. There was pain, yes, a deep ache that seemed to radiate from the bones themselves, but worse was the numbness, a disconnected feeling as if his fingers belonged to someone else. Edwin examined the hand carefully, flexing each finger gently. Thomas winced. "Can you make a fist?" Edwin asked. Thomas tried. His fingers curled slowly, reluctantly, stopping short of a full fist. The movement sent sharp pains shooting up his palm. "Bruised," Edwin said. "Maybe I cracked a bone, but I don't think so. You will need to rest it." "I cannot rest it," Thomas protested. "There is too much work." "Then you will lose the use of it entirely," Edwin said flatly. "I have seen this before, Thomas. The hand is damaged. If you continue to use it now while it is weak, you risk permanent injury. Rest it for a few days. A week would be better. We cannot afford for me to stop working for a week." Edwin's face softened slightly. "We cannot afford for you to permanently damage your hand either. Listen to me, lad. I have been doing this work for nearly 30 years. I have seen strong men lose the use of their hands through stubbornness, through pushing past injury. The hand is a complex thing. It is not like a leg that can heal while you walk. The hand must be used carefully or not at all while it heals, or it will never fully heal." Thomas knew Edwin was right, but the knowledge sat uneasily. A week without work meant a week without the pennies Edwin paid him, pennies he desperately needed. His rent on the room, small as it was, still had to be paid. He needed to buy food, lamp oil, and the small necessaries of life. And beyond his own needs, there was the money he tried to send home to his family. Every week he did not work was a week his family would go without his help. But his hand throbbed, a steady ache that made holding anything difficult, and he knew that Edwin spoke truth. Reluctantly, he nodded. A few days then. Not a week. A few days. Edwin accepted this compromise. You can still help. You can work the bellows, sort stock, handle tasks that do not require gripping tools. But no hammering, no tong work. Agreed. Agreed. The next few days were frustrating beyond measure. Thomas felt useless, watching Edwin work while he performed simple tasks that required little skill. He kept his left hand wrapped in a strip of cloth, trying to protect it, but it remained swollen and tender. At night, lying in his cold room, he would unwrap it and examine it by candlelight, looking for signs of improvement. The bruising spread, dark purple and yellow-green, but gradually the swelling began to subside. The numbness faded, replaced by pins and needles sensations that were almost worse. On the third day, Agnes found him sitting on the bench outside the forge during the midday meal, flexing his hand carefully, testing the fingers. "I heard you were hurt," she said, her voice soft with concern. Thomas felt his face grow warm despite the cold. "It is nothing serious. Just bruised." She sat beside him, uninvited but not unwelcome. "My father says blacksmith work is the most dangerous trade except soldiering." "It has its risks," Thomas admitted. "But every trade does. Your father works with ovens hot enough to burn flesh from bone." "True," she said. "But he has never lost fingers." She looked at his hand, still wrapped in its cloth. "May I?" He unwrapped it slowly, self-conscious about the bruising, the way the hand looked damaged and weak. She took it gently in both of hers, examining it with a serious expression. Her hands were warm, soft compared to his calloused ones. "It is healing," she said. "The bruising will fade. My mother has a salve that might help if you would like." "I would. Thank you." She smiled, and Thomas felt his heart do those strange acrobatics again. "I will bring it this evening." She released his hand, but slowly, as if reluctant. "You must be careful, Thomas. Your hands are precious. They are your future." After she left, Thomas sat for a long time, staring at his hands. She was right, of course. His hands were his future, his ticket to a better life, his means of supporting himself and eventually a family. Without them, he was nothing. He thought of Edwin, working still despite twisted fingers and missing digits. How much pain did Edwin endure each day? How much effort did it take to grip a hammer and tongs with damaged hands? That evening, Agnes brought the salve, a mixture her mother made from herbs and beeswax. It smelled pungent, almost medicinal, and when she rubbed it into his bruised hand, he felt immediate relief, a cooling sensation that eased the ache. "Twice daily," she instructed, "morning and evening. And keep it wrapped between times to keep it warm." "Thank you," he said, meaning more than just gratitude for the salve. She understood. Her smile was knowing, gentle. "Be careful, Thomas. I would not want to see you hurt again." By the end of the week, His hand had recovered enough for light work. Edwin watched him carefully, making sure he did not push too hard too fast. The work they tackled was simple, nothing requiring great grip strength or precision. Gradually, carefully, Thomas rebuilt his confidence and capability. The hand would never be quite the same, he realized. There was a slight weakness, a tendency to tire more quickly than the right hand, but it was functional, and that was what mattered. Christmas came, bringing a brief respite from work. The village celebrated with as much joy as could be managed in the depths of winter. There was a special mass, and afterward the lord of the manor provided ale and bread for all his tenants and workers. Thomas attended, standing in the packed church, singing the familiar hymns, feeling the warmth of the crowd pressed close together. He saw Agnes with her family, caught her eye, and they exchanged smiles. The new year arrived, 1348 now, and with it came weather colder than anyone could remember. The forge became a refuge, perhaps the warmest place in the village apart from the bakery ovens. People would sometimes come just to stand near it, warming themselves, even when they had no business. Edwin allowed this, understanding that the forge served the community in more ways than just making tools. January brought new challenges. The deep cold made iron brittle, prone to cracking if not worked exactly right. The coal was harder to keep burning properly. And everyone's hands, were perpetually cold. Thomas became obsessive about keeping his hands warm, following Edwin's warnings, never beginning work until he was certain his fingers were limber and responsive. He saw the wisdom in this caution. The village's cobbler lost the tip of a finger to frostbite, having worked too long in the cold without proper protection. The miller's son broke his thumb when it was too cold and stiff to pull away quickly enough from a grinding stone. It was mid-January when Thomas first heard the rumors. A merchant passing through spoke of a strange sickness in the south, in Italy and France. People falling ill with fever and swellings, dying within days. The merchant had few details and seemed uncertain whether to believe the stories himself. "Probably just winter fever," he said, shaking his head. "Always worse in harsh years like this." Thomas thought little of it. Sickness was a constant companion of winter. Every year people die of fevers, coughs, and wasting diseases that consume the weak. It was tragic but not unusual. He had more immediate concerns. His hands, which continued to ache in the cold despite careful care. His work, which seemed to pile up faster than he and Edwin could complete it. And Agnes, who occupied an increasing portion of his thoughts. She had begun bringing him his midday meal, her excuse being that it was convenient since he rented the room above her father's shop. Thomas suspected the real reason was different and hoped it was different. They would sit together on the bench outside the forge, eating bread and cheese, talking about small things. She told him about her mother's weaving, about her younger brother's mischief, about the gossip of the village. He told her about the work, about the satisfaction of making things, about his hopes to one day have his own forge. "Where would you go?" she asked one day. "When your apprenticeship is done?" "I do not know," Thomas admitted. Master Edwin suggested I might take over from him eventually. He has no sons and his hands. He trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of his master. His hands are getting worse, Agnes finished quietly. Everyone can see it. He hides it well, but the pain shows in his face. Thomas nodded. He should rest more, but he says he cannot afford to. The work must be done, and there is only me to help him. Then he needs another apprentice, Agnes said practically. Someone younger, to learn while you are still there to teach. That way, when you do take over, you will have help. It was a sensible idea, but Thomas knew the complications. Taking on an apprentice required resources, food and space and time to teach. Perhaps, he said, when times are better. February arrived with slightly warmer weather, though warmer was relative. The worst of the cold seemed to break, and people ventured out more freely. There was a sense of having survived, of the worst being past, even though March and April could still bring harsh weather. It was late February when the merchant came back through, the same one who had spoken of sickness in the south. His face was gray, his manner distressed. He went directly to the priest, spoke with him for a long time behind closed doors. When they emerged, the priest called a meeting of the village. They gathered in the church, every person who could walk, packing the space until there was barely room to stand. The priest climbed to his pulpit, his face grave. I have received disturbing news, he began. The sickness that was reported in the south has spread. It has reached London. It has reached York. A murmur ran through the crowd, anxious, uncertain. The symptoms are distinctive, the priest continued. High fever, swellings in the neck and armpits and groin. Dark marks on the skin. Most who fall ill die within 3 to 5 days. It spreads quickly, moving from person to person, from town to town. What causes it? Someone called out. The priest shook his head. No one knows. Some say it is miasma, bad air from swamps and rotting matter. Some say it is God's punishment for sin. The physicians do not agree among themselves. What should we do? This from a woman near the front, her voice tight with fear. Pray, the priest said. Keep yourselves clean. Avoid crowds when possible. If someone falls ill, isolate them. Send it to me immediately. Beyond that, he spread his hands helplessly. We are in God's hands. The meeting dissolved into anxious conversation. Thomas walked home in a daze, trying to process what he had heard. Sickness spreading from town to town. Death in days. It seemed impossible, like something from a story, not real life. Over the following weeks, the fear of sickness hung over the village like a shroud, but life continued because it had to. Fields needed preparing for spring planting, tools needed mending, animals needed tending. Thomas and Edwin worked through their backlog, and Thomas found himself grateful for the demanding nature of the work. When his hands were busy shaping iron, his mind had less room for worry about invisible threats. March arrived with its characteristic unpredictability, warm days followed by sudden freezes, rain that turned the lanes to sucking mud. The forge work changed with the season. Farmers brought their plows for sharpening and repair, preparing for the critical work of spring planting. Each plowshare had to be examined carefully, the cutting edge assessed for cracks or excessive wear. Some could be sharpened and returned. Others needed more extensive repair, heating and hammering to reshape worn metal, sometimes forge welding new pieces onto damaged sections. Thomas's hands had recovered from the January injury, though he noticed they fatigued more quickly than before. He compensated by taking brief rests, flexing his fingers, warming them at the forge when they grew stiff. Edwin noticed but said nothing, trusting Thomas to manage his own limits. It was during this period that Thomas began to truly master the subtleties of his craft. There was a moment, repeated countless times each day, when hot metal sat on the anvil and the hammer was raised, when the blacksmith had to make a dozen tiny decisions simultaneously. Where exactly to strike? How hard is it? At what angle should the metal be repositioned first? Was it still hot enough, or did it need to return to the forge? These decisions came faster than conscious thought, becoming instinct, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of hammer blows encoded into muscle and nerve. He still made mistakes, of course. A plowshare that cracked because he had worked it too cold. A hinge that bent slightly out of true. A chain link that was not quite fully welded and had to be redone. But the mistakes were becoming less frequent, and more importantly, he could usually see them coming, could feel when something was going wrong and correct it before disaster struck. "You are thinking like a smith now," Edwin told him one afternoon, watching Thomas carefully shape a complex bracket for a cart. Not just following steps, but understanding why each step matters. The praise warmed Thomas more than the forge fire. He was thinking like a smith. His hands, despite their aches and scars, were becoming the hands of a craftsman. When he looked at a piece of iron stock now, he could envision what it might become, could see the sequence of heats and hammer blows that would transform raw material into finished objects. Agnes noticed the change too. "You carry yourself differently now," she said one day as they sat together during the midday break. The weather was mild enough that they could sit outside comfortably, watching clouds move across the sky. More confident. Thomas considered this. "I suppose I feel more certain of my skill. Less afraid of making errors." "My father says the same happens with baking," Agnes said. "At first you follow the recipe exactly, terrified of ruining the bread. But eventually you understand the dough, can feel when it needs more water or more kneading, and can adjust for differences in the flour or the weather. The knowledge moves from your head to your hands." "Yes," Thomas said, surprised at how perfectly she had captured it. "Exactly that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Agnes said, "Thomas, if this sickness comes here, if things become difficult, I want you to know that you should not feel obligated to continue bringing your rent. My father will understand. We would not turn you out." He looked at her, saw the worry in her eyes. "That is kind, but I will manage." The work continues, and people will always need a blacksmith. I know. I just wanted you to know. In case, she stood brushing crumbs from her skirt. I should get back. Mother needs help with the washing. As she walked away, Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. The sickness had not reached them, might never reach them, but already it was changing things, making people think about contingencies and worst possibilities. April brought warmer weather and the intensive work of spring. The village came alive with activity. Fields were plowed and planted. Animals that had been kept in barns all winter were released to pasture, their joy at freedom almost comical. Children played in the lanes, their laughter a sound that had been largely absent during the dark months. The world seemed to be renewing itself, and the fears of February faded somewhat, pushed back by the immediate demands of the growing season. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, helping Edwin keep pace with the flood of repair work and new commissions. His hands were in constant use, gripping hammer and tongs, positioning work, operating the bellows. He developed new calluses over old ones, and the muscles of his forearms grew hard as the iron he worked. At night, he would fall into his bed exhausted, his hands aching, but it was the good ache of hard work, not the sharp pain of injury. He and Agnes had established a pattern now, eating together most days, talking about everything and nothing. He had not spoken of his feelings directly, was not sure how to, but he thought she knew. The way she smiled at him, the way she found excuses to touch his arm or hand in passing, suggested that his affection was not unwelcome. It gave him something to hope for, a future he could envision that included more than just work. The first week of May, a peddler came through the village, his cart loaded with ribbons and needles, small mirrors and buttons, the little luxuries that made life more than mere survival. He set up in the village square, and people came to browse, to gossip, to hear news from the wider world. Thomas was working when he heard the commotion, voices raised in alarm. He set down his hammer and stepped outside. People were running toward the square, their faces showing fear and confusion. He followed, Edwin beside him. In the square, the peddler was standing in his cart, shouting. His face was flushed, his gestures wild. "It is everywhere," he was saying. "London is half dead. The roads are clogged with people fleeing, spreading the sickness as they go. York has closed its gates. The monasteries are overwhelmed with sickness and dying." The crowd pressed closer, everyone trying to hear, trying to understand. The priest pushed his way through. "Calm yourself," he commanded. "Tell us plainly what you have seen." The peddler took a shaking breath. "I was in York 3 weeks ago. The sickness had just arrived. By the time I left 2 days later, hundreds were falling ill. The symptoms are unmistakable, fever so high it drives men mad. Swellings, buboes they call them, in the neck and groin and armpits, some as large as apples. Dark bruises spreading across the skin. And the smell of the sick is like nothing I have ever encountered, sweet and rotten together." "How does it spread?" someone asked. "No one knows for certain. Some say through bad air, that you can catch it just by breathing near a sick person. Some say through touch. I have heard that entire households fall ill, one after another, until all are dead. A woman began to cry. Others joined in, a rising sound of fear and grief for deaths that had not yet occurred but seemed inevitable. "What can we do?" the priest asked. "You have traveled. What have you seen that works?" The peddler shook his head helplessly. "Nothing works. The physicians try bleeding, purging, prayers, charms. Nothing makes a difference. Those who fall ill almost always die. The only safety is in avoiding the sick entirely." "Then we must close the village," someone said. "Turn away strangers. Let no one in or out." "That did not save York," the peddler said. "The sickness came anyway." The meeting dissolved into chaos, everyone talking at once, fear turning to anger, anger seeking a target. The peddler, realizing he was becoming that target, hurriedly packed his cart and left, refusing to stay even when offered good money for his goods. That night the village council met, along with the priest and the Lord's bailiff. Thomas was not present, but he heard the results the next day. The village would not close entirely, but strangers would be questioned carefully before being allowed to stay. Anyone showing signs of sickness would be turned away immediately. The priest organized prayer vigils, special masses, processions asking for God's protection. The work at the forge continued, but the mood had changed. People spoke in hushed voices and watched each other for signs of illness. Every cough, every sneeze, every complaint of tiredness was met with suspicious looks. The fear was corrosive, eating away at the normal bonds of community. Edwin seemed less worried than most. "We have been through plagues before," he told Thomas. "Not in your lifetime, perhaps, but I remember when I was a boy, a great fever that swept through and took a third of the village. It was terrible, yes, but it passed. This will pass too." But the peddler said. The peddler was frightened and spreading that fear, Edwin interrupted. "Yes, there is sickness. Yes, it is serious, but panic helps no one. We will take sensible precautions and continue our work. The village needs us. Fear of future sickness is no excuse to neglect present duties." Thomas tried to take comfort in Edwin's calm, but it was difficult. At night, lying in his bed, he would imagine the sickness arriving, would picture Agnes falling ill, or Edwin, or himself. The descriptions of the symptoms were horrifying. Fever and swellings and death within days. How did one prepare for such a thing? How did one defend against an enemy that could not be seen or fought? May progressed, warm and beautiful, the kind of weather that made it hard to believe anything bad could exist in the world. The fields turned green with new growth. Apple trees blossomed, filling the air with their delicate scent. Birds nested in the eaves and hedgerows, their songs a constant cheerful background. Thomas and Agnes walked together one Sunday afternoon after Mass, following the path that led along the river. The water ran clear and cold from the hills, and willows trailed their branches in the current. It was the first time they had been truly alone together, away from the village and prying eyes. "Are you frightened?" Agnes asked. "Of the sickness." Thomas considered lying, saying he was brave and unconcerned. But he found he could not lie to her. "Yes, I am frightened. Frightened of falling ill, of dying before I have really lived. Frightened of losing people He stopped, not quite able to finish the thought. "People you care about," Agnes supplied gently. "Yes." She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Her hand was warm and soft, and the simple contact seemed to anchor him, to make the fear slightly more manageable. "I am frightened too," she admitted. "But I find I am less frightened when I am with you." They walked on, hand in hand, not speaking, not needing to. The river flowed beside them, indifferent to human fears and hopes, following its ancient path to the sea. Birds called. The wind moved through new leaves with a sound like whispered secrets. For that afternoon, the world was at peace. The sickness came to their village on the 13th of June, brought by a wool merchant traveling from York. He had seemed healthy when he arrived, negotiating prices with the local shepherds, examining fleeces, making his usual rounds. He stayed at the inn, sharing the common room with locals, eating meals prepared by the innkeeper's wife. 2 days after his arrival, he collapsed with fever. By evening, the swellings had appeared, hard lumps in his neck that grew visibly larger as the hours passed. The innkeeper, terrified, sent for the priest. The priest came, administered last rites, then ordered the man isolated in a room at the inn. No one else was to enter or leave. The merchant died on the morning of the 3rd day. His body was wrapped in a sheet and buried immediately in a hastily dug grave at the far edge of the churchyard, as far from other graves as possible. The priest performed a quick service, and everyone hurried away, as if speed could protect them from the invisible contagion. 3 days later, the innkeeper's wife fell ill. Then the innkeeper himself. Then 2 men who had been drinking in the common room the night the merchant arrived. The pattern was clear and terrible. The sickness was spreading, moving from person to person through contact or proximity, selecting its victims with seemingly random malice. The village fragmented almost overnight. Families locked themselves in their homes, refusing visitors. The market square stood empty. Even the church was largely abandoned, though the priest continued to hold services for the handful of faithful or desperate who attended. The lord of the manor retreated to his house and barred the gates, allowing no one in or out. Thomas and Edwin continued to work, but carefully. They spoke with customers from outside, maintaining distance, accepting payment left on a stone rather than handed directly. Edwin rigged a bell outside the forge that could be rung to summon them, without requiring anyone to enter. The work slowed dramatically. Most people were too frightened or too distracted to worry about broken tools. Agnes's family remained healthy, as did Thomas and Edwin. For a few weeks there was hope that perhaps the worst would pass them by, that the initial cluster of illness would burn itself out without spreading further. Thomas continued to see Agnes, though more carefully now, always meeting outdoors, never in enclosed spaces where bad air might accumulate. Then in early July, Edwin complained of tiredness. Thomas noticed but thought nothing of it initially. The heat of summer made working at the forge exhausting, and Edwin was not young. But the next day Edwin was worse, moving slowly, his face pale. "I think I need to rest today," he said, his voice rough. "Can you manage the forge alone?" "Of course," Thomas said, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "Go home. Asleep. You will feel better tomorrow." But Edwin did not feel better. Thomas went to check on him that evening and found him in bed, shivering despite the warmth of the summer night. And there, on his neck, just visible above his collar, was a swelling, small but unmistakable. Thomas felt the bottom drop out of his world. No. Not Edwin. Not his master, his teacher, the closest thing he had to a father in this village. "I will get the priest," he managed to say. Edwin gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "No. There is nothing the priest can do. Listen to me, Thomas. You must not come back here. You must not risk yourself. The forge is yours now. Take care of it. Serve the village." His voice was weakening already, the fever taking hold. "I cannot just abandon you," Thomas protested. "You can. You must." Edwin's grip loosened, his hand falling back to the bed. "You are a good smith, Thomas. Better than you know. You will do well. Just remember what I taught you. About the cold, about respecting your limits. Your hands are precious. Keep them safe." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to stay, wanted to do something, anything. But he could see the futility. The sickness had taken Edwin, and nothing Thomas did would change that. All he could do was honor his master's last wishes. He left, walking through the dark village, tears streaming down his face. He went to the forge, not his room, and sat in the dark workspace, surrounded by the tools and implements that Edwin had used for 30 years. The anvil gleamed dully in the faint light from the banked coals. The hammers hung in their places. Everything was as it should be, except that the man who gave these tools meaning was dying. Edwin lasted 2 days, suffering through the fever and the grotesque swellings, and finally the strange dark marks that appeared on his skin like bruises but were something far worse. The priest visited once, briefly, and administered last rites from the doorway. Edwin died alone, as so many were dying, abandoned by the living who were too frightened to offer comfort to the dying. The death shook Thomas profoundly. Edwin had been his master, yes, but also his protector, his guide, the standard against which he measured himself. Without Edwin, Thomas felt unmoored, adrift in a suddenly hostile world. He was 19 years old, a blacksmith with all his skills but none of his confidence, and the village was disintegrating around him. He buried Edwin himself, unable to find anyone else willing to help. He dug the grave in the churchyard, 6 feet deep, the prescribed depth for plague victims. He wrapped Edwin's body in a sheet, struggling with the weight and the smell and the reality of death. He lowered the body into the earth and filled the grave. the sound of dirt striking the wrapped form one of the worst sounds he had ever heard. When it was done, he stood by the fresh grave, filthy and exhausted and grieving. "I will try to honor what you taught me," he said aloud, not sure if he was praying or simply talking to the dead. "I will be careful. I will respect my limits. I will serve the village as you did." The sickness continued its work through July and into August. The village, which had numbered perhaps 300 souls at the beginning of the year, shrank steadily. The very young and very old went first, their bodies unable to fight the fever, but the sickness did not discriminate. Strong young men and women fell as easily as the weak. Whole families disappeared, houses standing empty, doors barred from the inside where everyone had died together. Thomas continued to work, partly because the work needed doing, but mostly because it kept him sane. Each morning he lit the forge. Each day he worked on whatever repairs had been left for him. Each evening he banked the coals and returned to his room above the bakery. Agnes and her family remained healthy, and he saw her briefly most days, though they no longer touched, no longer walked together. The fear had driven them apart, fear of spreading sickness, fear of caring too much about someone who might be dead tomorrow. His hands troubled him increasingly during this period. The stress and grief and exhaustion manifested physically. His fingers would cramp unexpectedly, curling into claws that had to be slowly massaged straight. He developed tremors, slight but noticeable, that made precise work difficult. At night his hands ached deeply, a bone pain that sleep did not ease. He tried to follow Edwin's teachings about respecting limits, but the limits were becoming harder to respect. He was the only blacksmith now, and the work did not stop simply because he was tired or hurting. Farmers still needed tools. Horses still needed shoes. The mechanisms of daily life still required the blacksmith's art. One morning in late August, he was working on a particularly difficult repair, a broken axle for the miller's cart. The piece required heating nearly to welding temperature, and then careful hammering to reshape the metal. His hands were already tired, slightly stiff despite his attempts to warm them thoroughly. He should have waited, should have taken more time to prepare, but he was behind on his work and the miller needed the cart. He heated the piece, watching the color climb from red to orange to yellow. When it reached the right temperature, he pulled it from the coals and positioned it on the anvil. His left hand gripped the tongs, his right raised the hammer. He struck and the impact rang true. He struck again. On the third blow, his left hand cramped suddenly, his fingers spasming closed on the tong handles. The workpiece shifted, rolling on the anvil. Thomas tried to correct, tried to reposition, but his left hand would not respond properly. The piece rolled further and he made a choice, a split-second decision born of fatigue and frustration and too many weeks of fear. He reached with his right hand, the hand that still held the hammer, to catch the rolling piece. The heat was immense, immediate, total. Yellow-hot iron touched skin and there was a smell, a horrible smell of burning flesh. Thomas jerked back, dropping the hammer, the piece clattering to the floor. He stared at his right hand, at the palm where a stripe of blackened, blistered skin marked where the hot metal had kissed it. The pain came a heartbeat later, an explosion of sensation so intense it whited out everything else. He heard himself cry out, a sound that seemed to come from someone else. He stumbled to the slack tub and plunged his hand into the water. The cool liquid did nothing. The burn was too deep, the damage too complete. The water turned pink with fluids leaking from the destroyed tissue. He did not know how long he stood there, hand in the water, gasping with pain. Eventually, Agnes found him, drawn by his cry. She took one look at his hand and went pale. "Oh, Thomas. Oh, no. I was careless," he managed through gritted teeth. "Tired. My hands are cramped. I should have stopped." She helped him from the forge to her family's kitchen, where her mother examined the burn. The older woman's face was grave. "This needs proper tending," she said. "The barber surgeon, if he still lives, or the wise woman." The barber surgeon had died of the plague 3 weeks earlier, one of the many losses that had stripped the village of its essential people. The wise woman, old Martha, who lived in a cottage at the edge of the woods, was still alive, though whether from luck or some knowledge of herbs that protected her, no one could say. Agnes's mother sent her son running to fetch Martha, while she carefully cleaned Thomas's hand with boiled water, trying not to cause more damage to the already ruined flesh. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his vision swimming, trying not to vomit from the pain. He watched in a detached way as Agnes's mother worked, her movements gentle but thorough. The burn ran diagonally across his palm, from the base of his thumb to the heel of his hand, a stripe perhaps 2 inches wide where the hot metal had branded him. The flesh was blackened in the center, fatting to angry red blisters at the edges. Already the hand was beginning to swell. Martha arrived within the hour, a woman of perhaps 60 years with sharp eyes and hands that moved with practiced certainty. She examined the burn without touching it, her expression unreadable. "How hot was the metal?" she asked. "Yellow-white," Thomas said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Near welding temperature." Martha nodded slowly. "You know what this means, boy." He did know, but he could not make himself say it. "The flesh is burned through to the bone," Martha said, her voice neither gentle nor harsh, simply factual. "Burns this deep do not heal properly. The flesh dies, turns black and starts to rot. The corruption spreads up through the arm and when it reaches the heart." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "You have to take it," Thomas said, the words coming out flat, emotionless. "The hand. You have to take it." "Not yet," Martha said. "First we try to save it. There are poultices that sometimes work, herbs that fight corruption. If we can keep the rot from spreading, you might keep the hand, though it will never work properly again. But you must understand, boy, the chances are not good. Most likely in 2 or 3 days we will have to take it. And if we wait too long, if the corruption spreads too far, we will have to take the arm or you will die." Agnes made a sound, quickly stifled. Thomas could not look at her. He stared at his ruined hand, at the end of everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped to become. A blacksmith with one hand was no blacksmith at all. The work required both hands, constantly, coordinating movements too complex for a single hand to manage. Even with Edwin's twisted, damaged hands, he had possessed all his fingers, could grip and position and control the work. But this was catastrophic. "Do what you can," he said to Martha. "Please." She set to work, mixing a poultice from herbs she carried in a leather satchel. Thomas smelled honey, which she said would help fight corruption, and garlic, crushed and mixed with other things he did not recognize. She spread this mixture across the burn, thick as butter, then wrapped the hand in clean linen. "Change the dressing twice daily," she instructed Agnes's mother. "Keep it clean. If the flesh turns black beyond the burn, if red streaks appear running up his arm, if he develops fever, send for me immediately. Those are signs the corruption is spreading." "And if it spreads?" Agnes's mother asked. "Then we take the hand before it kills him." Martha left, refusing payment, saying simply that these were times when everyone had to help everyone else survive. Thomas sat at the table after she was gone, his bandaged hand resting on the wood, feeling the throb of pain that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Agnes sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder, not speaking because there was nothing to say. That night was the longest of Thomas's life. The pain was constant, unrelenting, a burning sensation that seemed to spread beyond his hand to his entire arm, his shoulder, his neck. He could not sleep, could only lie on his bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move as clouds passed across the moon. His future, which had seemed so certain just that morning, had evaporated like water on hot iron. What was he now? What would he become? He thought of Edwin, of that conversation months ago when Edwin had told the story of losing his fingers. "I was lucky in a way," Edwin had said. "I kept enough to continue working." Thomas had not understood then what that statement truly meant, the depth of gratitude implied in calling such a loss lucky. He understood now. Edwin had kept enough, Thomas might not. Agnes came in the morning bringing bread and weak ale. She found him still awake, gray with pain and exhaustion. "You need to eat," she said, her voice firm despite the tears he could see in her eyes. "I am not hungry. I do not care. You will eat anyway. You need strength to heal." She was right, of course. He forced down the bread, chewing mechanically, swallowing though it felt like stones in his throat. The ale helped, slightly, giving him something to focus on besides the pain. Agnes's mother changed the dressing, carefully unwrapping the bandage, examining the burn beneath. Thomas forced himself to look. The flesh was angry and swollen, but it did not look worse than it had the day before. The black stripe remained black, the blistered edges remained blistered. No red streaks ran up his arm. These were small mercies, but he clung to them. The poultice was reapplied, fresh bandages wrapped, and then Agnes's mother left them alone. Agnes sat on the edge of his bed, taking his good hand in both of hers. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "you are still Thomas. Still the person who matters to me." He wanted to believe her, but he could not. "I am a blacksmith," he said. "Or I was. Without two hands I am nothing. I cannot work. I cannot support myself, cannot send money to my family, cannot." He stopped, unable to continue. "You are not nothing," Agnes said fiercely. "You are skilled and clever. You know the work even if you cannot do it with your own hands. You can teach. You can oversee. You can find a way." How? The word came out bitter, angry. Who would trust a one-handed smith to teach them? What work could I oversee if I cannot demonstrate the techniques? Agnes had no answer for that. She simply held his hand, her thumb moving gently across his knuckles, and her presence was the only comfort available to him. The days that followed were a blur of pain and fever. The burn did not improve, but neither did it dramatically worsen. The flesh remained damaged but stable, hovering in that uncertain territory between healing and corruption. Martha came each day to examine it, her expression giving away nothing. She changed the poultices, adjusting the mixture of herbs, trying different combinations, fighting a slow war against infection and rot. Thomas drifted in and out of coherence. Sometimes he would wake to find Agnes sitting beside his bed, reading aloud from a prayer book or simply talking about small things, her voice a gentle anchor to reality. Sometimes he would wake to find night had fallen and he was alone, the darkness pressing close. He dreamed feverishly, strange visions of the forge, of hammers falling on metal that screamed like living things, of his hands turning to iron and shattering under the hammer's blow. On the fourth day, Martha made her decision. Thomas was more lucid that morning, the fever having broken somewhat during the night. She examined the burn carefully, probing gently at the edges of the blackened flesh. "The corruption is spreading," she said. "Slowly but spreading. The flesh here and here," she indicated areas at the edges of the burn, "is dying. If we wait longer, we risk losing the whole arm. We must hold hands today." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Thomas looked at his hand, at the damaged palm that had nevertheless remained his hand, still connected to his body, still part of him. After today it would be gone, cut away, disposed of like garbage. He would be a cripple, incomplete, a man defined by what he lacked rather than what he possessed. "Do it," he said, his voice hollow. They prepared the baker's kitchen, clearing the large table, boiling water, and laying out Martha's tools. Thomas saw them and felt his stomach twist. A knife, a saw, needles and thread, strips of leather for tying off blood vessels, a brand heated in the fire for cauterizing. Medieval surgery was brutal, direct, a matter of cutting and burning and helping the patient survive the trauma. Agnes's father produced a bottle of strong spirits, something he normally sold only for medicinal purposes. "Drink," he instructed Thomas, "as much as you can stomach. It will help with the pain." Thomas drank, the liquid burning his throat, spreading warmth through his belly. He drank until the room began to spin slightly, until the edge came off his fear. They positioned him at the table, his right arm extended, his left arm bound to his side so he could not interfere. Agnes's father and her brother would hold him down. Agnes herself stood nearby with clean clothes and boiled water, her face pale but determined. Martha positioned herself at Thomas's right side, examining his hand one final time. "I will take it here," she said, indicating a point on his forearm about 3 inches below his elbow. "We must cut well above the corruption to ensure none remains. You will still have most of your forearm and can still use your elbow. That is something." It was something, Thomas supposed, though it felt like nothing at all. "Are you ready?" Martha asked. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. He looked at Agnes, trying to memorize her face, using her as an anchor against what was coming. Martha took the knife, the blade gleaming in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. She positioned it against Thomas's forearm, just above where she had indicated. "Hold him," she instructed. Agnes's father and brother gripped Thomas's shoulders, pressing him down against the table. Martha's hand was steady as she began to cut. The pain was beyond anything Thomas had imagined possible. The knife sliced through skin and muscle, and Thomas heard himself scream, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, from some primal place beyond language or thought. He tried to pull away, but the hands holding him were strong, implacable. The knife continued its work, cutting deeper, severing tendons and blood vessels. Blood poured from the wound, shocking in its volume and redness. Agnes moved quickly, pressing clothes against the flow, but it seemed unstoppable, a river of crimson running across the table and dripping to the floor. Thomas's vision grayed at the edges. He was going to die here, he thought distantly, going to bleed out on the baker's table, and perhaps that would be better than living as half a man. Martha worked with practiced efficiency, tying off the major blood vessels with strips of leather, knotting them tight to stop the bleeding. The flow slowed but did not stop entirely. She picked up the saw, a small thing with fine teeth, and positioned it against the bone that now showed white in the midst of red flesh. The sound of the saw cutting through bone was worse than the pain, a grinding, scraping sound that went on and on. Thomas could feel the vibration traveling through his arm, through his entire body. He was screaming again, or still screaming, he could not tell. Time had lost all meaning. There was only pain and the sound of the saw and the knowledge that his hand, his precious hand, was being separated from his body. Finally, the saw broke through the far side of the bone. Martha set it aside and pulled, and the severed portion of Thomas's arm came away. She handed it to Agnes's mother, who wrapped it in a cloth and carried it away. Thomas did not watch. He could not bear to see it, the hand that had shaped iron and held tools and touched Agnes's face, now just dead meat to be buried or burned. Martha picked up the heated brand. "This will be the worst part," she warned, and then pressed the red-hot iron against the stump of Thomas's arm. The searing pain was absolute, total, a white fire that consumed everything else. Thomas felt his consciousness fracture, felt himself floating somewhere above the scene, watching from a great distance as his body convulsed, and Agnes cried and Martha held the brand steady, cauterizing the wound, sealing the blood vessels, burning away any remaining corruption. Then there was nothing, darkness swallowing him whole, and he fell into it gratefully. He woke to find himself back in his bed, unsure how much time had passed. His right arm ended just below the elbow, wrapped in clean bandages. The pain was still present but somehow distant, muted, as if it belonged to someone else. He felt hollow, scooped out, a shell of a person with nothing inside. Agnes was there, sitting in the chair beside his bed. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, but when she saw he was awake, she smiled. "You are alive," she said simply. "Yes," he agreed, though he was not certain that was a good thing. "Martha says you will recover. The wound is clean. You will heal." "And then what?" The question came out harsh, angry. "I heal and become what? A cripple begging for charity." "You become whatever you choose to become," Agnes said firmly. "You are alive, Thomas. In the midst of plague, in the midst of all this death, you are alive. That matters." Did it matter? Thomas was not sure. He closed his eyes, retreating back into sleep, into the only escape available to him. The weeks that followed were a slow climb out of darkness. The physical healing was difficult but straightforward. Martha visited daily at first, then every other day, checking the stump, changing bandages, ensuring no infection took hold. The wound closed gradually, the flesh knitting together, forming a rounded end to what remained of his arm. It was ugly, Thomas thought, puckered and scarred, a constant visible reminder of his failure. But the physical healing was easier than the mental adjustment. Thomas had to relearn basic tasks, things he had done without thought for years. Dressing himself required new techniques. Eating was awkward, his left hand unaccustomed to wielding a knife. Writing, which he had never been particularly skilled at, became nearly impossible. Every activity reminded him of what he had lost, of the hand that was no longer there, but that his mind still sometimes insisted existed, creating phantom sensations of fingers that were gone. The village continued its slow death around him. The plague burned through like wildfire, and by September, Thomas estimated that perhaps half the original population remained. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, revealing dark interiors where entire families had perished. The fields were only partially harvested, lacking the laborers to bring in the crops. Weeds grew in the lanes. The church bell tolled daily for the dead, until finally the bell ringer himself died, and the bell fell silent. Agnes and her family survived, as did Thomas, though whether through luck or some quality of their constitution none could say. The baker continued to bake bread, though for far fewer customers. Agnes helped her mother with the household work and spent what time she could with Thomas, trying to pull him out of his despair. "The forge stands empty," she said to him one day in late September. They were sitting outside, watching leaves begin to turn color, the first signs of autumn's arrival. Someone needs to work on it. I cannot work it, Thomas said flatly. I have one hand. You have knowledge, Agnes countered. You have skill and experience. The village needs a blacksmith. Perhaps you cannot do the physical work yourself, but you could teach someone. You could supervise. Who would I teach? Who is left? John Miller's boy is 14, strong, healthy. He survived the plague. He needs a trade. Thomas shook his head. It takes years to learn smithing. I am barely competent myself, and I had 7 years of training. Then start teaching him. The village cannot wait for perfection. We need to be functional. Tools are breaking and no one can repair them. Winter is coming, and we need hooks and hinges and 100 other things. Please, Thomas. Try. He wanted to refuse, wanted to retreat into his bitterness and grief, but something in Agnes's voice, in her eyes, made him reconsider. She was right about the village needing a blacksmith. And perhaps she was right that he still had something to offer, even diminished as he was. I will think about it, he said finally. That night, unable to sleep, he walked to the forge. It stood dark and silent, the coals long cold. He lit a candle and looked around at the familiar space. Everything was as Edwin had left it, as Thomas himself had left it that terrible day in August. The anvil, the hammers, the tongs, the workbench with its array of tools, all waiting, patient, ready to be used. He picked up a hammer with his left hand, felt its weight, its balance. His left hand was strong enough, but it lacked the precision of his right, and lacked the years of training that had made his right hand so skilled. He set the hammer down and tried to pick up a pair of tongs. His grip was awkward, uncertain. How did one position work with only one hand? How did one strike accurately while also holding the piece? The answer was one could not alone. But with help, with another person to hold while he struck, or to strike while he held, perhaps then it might be possible. Not the same as before, not the seamless dance he and Edwin had performed, but something, a beginning. He left the forge with the first small stirring of something that might eventually become hope. The next morning, Thomas sought out John Miller's boy, whose name was Peter. He found the youth helping his father at the mill, carrying sacks of grain that still needed grinding despite the reduced population. Peter was tall for 14, gangly in the way of boys not quite finished growing, with a shock of brown hair and serious eyes that had seen too much death too young. "Your father can spare you," Thomas asked the miller. John Miller looked up from adjusting the millstone. "For what purpose?" "I need someone to learn blacksmithing." Agnes suggested Peter might be interested. Peter's eyes lit up, but his father looked skeptical. "No offense meant, Thomas, but how do you plan to teach smithing with?" He gestured vaguely at Thomas's right arm. "I still have my knowledge," Thomas said, trying to keep defensiveness from his voice. "I can demonstrate techniques with my left hand, and Peter can provide the right hand I lack. Together, we might manage what neither of us could do alone." The miller considered this, his expression thoughtful. The village does need a smith. And Peter needs a trade. Milling barely supports one family, let alone two. He looked at his son. What say you, boy? It is hard work, hot and dangerous. I want to try, Peter said immediately. So it was decided. Peter would come to the forge each morning at dawn, and Thomas would teach him what he could. They shook hands on it, and Thomas felt the strength in Peter's grip, the calluses already forming from mill work. Good hands, young hands, with all their fingers intact. Hands that might, with proper teaching, become a blacksmith's hands. The first days were awkward and frustrating for both of them. Thomas found teaching harder than he had anticipated. The skills that had become instinctive for him were difficult to break down into component parts, difficult to explain in words rather than demonstrate through action. And Peter, eager but completely untrained, made every possible mistake. No, you are holding the hammer wrong, Thomas would say for the 10th time. The handle should rest here in the palm, your fingers wrapping around it. You control the hammer, it does not control you. Peter would adjust his grip, try again, and produce another clumsy blow that sent sparks flying in wrong directions. Watch the metal, not the hammer, Thomas instructed. Your eyes tell your hands where to strike. If you watch the hammer, you will miss your target. Slowly, painfully slowly, Peter began to develop the basic skills. His hammer blows became more controlled, more accurate. He learned to read the color of hot iron, to judge when metal was ready to work and when it needed more time in the forge. He learned the rhythm of heating and hammering, the dance that Thomas and Edwin had performed so effortlessly. Thomas, meanwhile, learned to teach. He developed patience he had not known he possessed, finding ways to demonstrate techniques using his left hand, or by positioning Peter's hands correctly and having him feel the right motion. He learned to see the work through a student's eyes, to remember what it felt like to be uncertain and unskilled. They worked on simple projects at first. Nails, always nails, because the village needed them constantly and because they were excellent practice for basic techniques. Peter made hundreds of nails that first month, each one teaching his hands a little more about controlling metal, about the relationship between heat and malleability, about striking with purpose rather than merely hitting. Agnes brought their midday meal most days, and the three of them would sit outside the forge, eating and talking. These were surprisingly pleasant interludes. Peter was good company, full of questions about the work and observations about village life. Agnes seemed genuinely happy to see Thomas engaged again, teaching and planning rather than brooding on his loss. You look better, she told him one day when Peter had gone back to the mill for the afternoon. Not so gray. Thomas flexed his left hand, examining the new calluses forming from unaccustomed work. I suppose I have found something to care about besides my missing hand. Good, Agnes said firmly. The hand is gone. Mourning it will not bring it back. But you are still here, still needed, still capable of doing important work. I am not the smith I was, Thomas said quietly. No, Agnes agreed. You are becoming something different. Perhaps something better in some ways. Edwin was an excellent craftsman, but he was not a teacher. You are learning to be both. Her words stayed with him as autumn deepened into winter. The work continued, gradually becoming more complex as Peter's skills improved. They repaired broken tools, made new hinges for doors that had been damaged in the chaos of the plague months, crafted hooks and chains for the households that remained. The work was slower than it would have been with two skilled smiths, and some tasks remained beyond them, but they managed well enough. The village slowly stabilized in a new configuration. The plague had burned itself out, running out of new victims, leaving roughly half the original population alive. Those who remained began the work of rebuilding, of occupying empty houses, of redistributing land and responsibilities. There was a strange sense of opportunity mixed with the grief. Young men found themselves in possession of properties they would never have inherited. Women whose husbands had died remarried quickly, needing the partnership to survive. The social structure that had seemed so fixed and permanent proved to be fluid after all. Thomas's position improved unexpectedly. As the only person in the village with blacksmithing knowledge, he found himself in demand and able to command better prices for his work. The forge, which had belonged to Edwin, passed to Thomas by default since there was no one else to claim it. He was no longer an apprentice but a master, albeit an unusual one who worked through a student's hands. Winter came early that year, cold winds stripping the last leaves from the trees by mid-November. Thomas thought often of Edwin's warnings about cold hands and winter dangers. He made Peter understand the importance of warming his hands thoroughly before beginning work, of stopping when fingers grew stiff or numb, of respecting the forge's power. My master lost 2 fingers to hot iron, Thomas told Peter one cold morning as they waited for the forge to heat. I lost my hand the same way. Not because we did not know better, but because we were tired, distracted, pushed beyond our limits. The forge does not forgive mistakes, Peter. You must always be mindful. Peter nodded seriously, looking at Thomas's truncated arm. I will remember. They developed new techniques to accommodate Thomas's limitation. For tasks requiring precise positioning, Thomas would use his left hand to hold the tongs while Peter struck with the hammer. For tasks requiring powerful blows, Peter would hold while Thomas struck left-handed, his blows less precise than they had been with his right hand but still effective. They learned to communicate with a few words, developing signals and shared understanding that made the work flow more smoothly. Christmas came, a subdued celebration in a village still mourning its losses. The priest, who had survived the plague through what he called God's grace, and what others attributed to the isolation of his small rectory, held a special mass. Thomas attended with Agnes and her family, standing in a church that felt cavernously empty with so many familiar faces missing. After the service, the lord of the manor, who had also survived by barricading himself in his house for the duration of the plague, announced that he was sponsoring a feast for all who remained. It was partly celebration, partly an attempt to restore some sense of community to the fractured village. Tables were set up in the manor hall, and food appeared that many had not seen in months: roasted meat, white bread, cheese, even wine. Thomas found himself seated near the Lord's bailiff, who studied him with frank curiosity. "I hear you are teaching young Peter the smithing trade," the bailiff said. "I am trying," Thomas replied. Unusual situation. A one-handed master teaching an unskilled apprentice. "Yet from what I hear, you are managing adequately." "We do what we must." The bailiff nodded. "That we do. These are times that test us all, that force us to adapt or perish. You have adapted, Thomas. That speaks well of you." It was the first time someone in authority had acknowledged his efforts without pity or condescension, and Thomas felt a small glow of pride. He was adapting. He was finding a way forward despite his loss. As winter deepened, Thomas and Peter tackled increasingly complex projects. They repaired the mechanism for the church bell, which had frozen and cracked during a particularly cold spell. They made new tools for the carpenter, whose old ones had been lost when his workshop burned. They even attempted decorative ironwork, the leaves and vines that Thomas had learned from Edwin, with Peter doing the actual shaping while Thomas supervised and offered guidance. The work was satisfying in ways Thomas had not anticipated. There was a particular pleasure in watching Peter master a difficult technique, in seeing understanding dawn in the boy's eyes as he grasped some principle of the craft. Teaching, Thomas discovered, was its own kind of creation, shaping not metal but a person's skill and knowledge. His relationship with Agnes also deepened during this period. They spent more time together, talking about the future, making tentative plans. She made clear that his missing hand did not diminish him in her eyes, that she saw him as whole despite his physical incompleteness. "You define yourself too much by what you have lost," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire in her father's house. "I see what you have retained, what you have gained even. You are kinder than you were, more patient, more aware of others' struggles." "I am a cripple," Thomas said, though with less bitterness than he once would have used. "You are a survivor," Agnes corrected. "And a teacher and a smith, and a man I love. The missing hand is just one small part of who you are." Her words, her love, sustained him through the difficult winter. There were still dark days when he mourned what he had lost, when phantom pains tormented him, when he looked at his stump and felt diminished. But increasingly there were also days when he felt almost whole, when the work engaged him fully, when he could look at what he and Peter had accomplished and feel genuine pride. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, melting the snow, softening the frozen earth, bringing the first tentative flowers. The village, reduced but resilient, prepared for planting. Tools needed sharpening, plows needed repair, and the forge was busy from dawn to dusk. Peter had progressed remarkably. He was not yet a master smith, would not be for years, but he was competent at most common tasks. More importantly, he understood the principles of the work, could think through problems, and could adapt techniques to new situations. Thomas felt increasingly confident leaving Peter to work independently on simpler projects while he supervised or planned future work. One warm day in late April, a stranger arrived in the village, a journeyman blacksmith traveling in search of work. He was perhaps 25, skilled and experienced, and he sought out Thomas at the forge. "I heard this village needed a smith," he said, looking around at the workspace. "I heard the previous master died in the plague." "That is correct," Thomas said, aware of the man examining him, nodding his missing hand. "And you are." The journeyman's tone was not quite dismissive, but suggested skepticism. "I am the current master here. I trained under Edwin for 7 years before the plague." The journeyman's eyes flicked again to Thomas's truncated arm. "I mean no disrespect, but how do you manage the work with one hand?" Peter stepped forward, his young face serious. "We manage together. Thomas teaches, I work under his supervision. Between us, we handle whatever the village needs." The journeyman studied them both, then nodded slowly. "I see. Well, I am seeking a position. Would there be room for a journeyman here? I have my own tools, good references from my previous master. I could ease your burden considerably." Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to refuse, to prove that he and Peter could manage alone. But the practical part of his mind recognized the opportunity. A skilled journeyman would allow them to take on more complex work, to serve the village better, to actually build rather than merely maintain. "What is your name?" Thomas asked. "Robert, late of Lincoln." "Robert, I cannot pay much. The village is still recovering from the plague, and money is scarce. But you would have a place to sleep, meals, and a share of the profits from our work. And you would be working under unusual circumstances, taking direction from a one-handed master, and working alongside a boy who is still learning." Robert considered this, his eyes moving around the forge, assessing the tools, the stock of iron, the general state of the workspace. Finally, he nodded. "I have seen worse situations. And I like that you are honest about the limitations. Too many masters promise more than they can deliver. I will stay for a trial period, say 3 months, and we can decide if the arrangement suits us both." They shook on it, and the forge gained a third worker. Robert proved to be as skilled as he claimed, and to Thomas's relief, he seemed unbothered by taking direction from someone who could not demonstrate every technique personally. He worked well with Peter, patient with the boy's remaining gaps in knowledge, and he brought new techniques and approaches that enriched the forge's capabilities. With Robert's help, they began taking on larger commissions. They made gates for the Lord's Manor, elaborate pieces with scrollwork and decorative elements. They crafted specialized tools for the carpenter and the cooper. They even made a complete set of hardware for a new mill being built to replace one that had been abandoned when its owner died in the plague. Thomas found his role evolving. He did less of the actual physical work and more planning, designing, problem-solving. He would sketch out a piece, plan the sequence of operations, then supervise as Robert and Peter executed the work. His left hand remained useful for light tasks, and his knowledge was invaluable, but increasingly he was the mind of the operation while Robert and Peter were the hands. It was different from what he had imagined his life would be, but it was not worse. Different, not worse. That realization came to him one evening as he sat with Agnes, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about the future. About us." Agnes turned to look at him, her expression hopeful but guarded. "I have some savings now," Thomas continued. "Not much, but some. And the forge is doing well enough. I will never be wealthy, but I can support a household. If," he paused, suddenly nervous, "if you would consider marrying a one-handed blacksmith." Agnes laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Thomas, I would consider marrying you if you had no hands at all." "Yes. Yes, of course, yes." They married in June, a simple ceremony in the village church with the priest officiating and what remained of the community attending. Agnes wore a dress of blue wool that her mother had helped her make, and Thomas wore his best clothes, feeling self-conscious but happy. Peter served as his attendant, and Agnes's younger brother served as hers, and when the priest pronounced them married, Thomas felt something he had not felt in nearly a year: complete. They moved into the small house that had been Edwin's, which Thomas had inherited along with the forge. Agnes brought her few possessions, her clothes and linens and the small treasures every woman accumulated. They set up housekeeping together, learning the rhythms of shared life, of sleeping beside another person, of coordinating daily activities, of building a life together from the ruins of what had been. Summer passed in productive work and domestic happiness. The forge thrived under the management of 3 workers. Robert proved reliable and skilled, content to remain as a journeyman rather than seeking to establish his own forge. Peter continued to improve, his natural aptitude combined with consistent practice making him increasingly valuable. And Thomas found satisfaction in his role as master, teacher, and planner. His missing hand troubled him less as time passed. He had learned to compensate, to do most daily tasks with his left hand and the stump of his right arm, which he discovered could be used to brace objects or provide leverage. The phantom pains faded, occurring less frequently and with less intensity. He would never be whole in body, but he was learning to be whole in spirit. In August, Agnes told him she was pregnant. The news filled Thomas with a complex mix of emotions, joy certainly, but also fear. What kind of father could he be with one hand? How would he hold his child, protect his child, teach his child? "You will be a good father," Agnes said firmly when he voiced these concerns. "Not despite your injury, but perhaps because of it. You have learned lessons about adapting, about finding new ways to accomplish necessary tasks. Those are lessons worth passing on." The child came in early spring, a daughter they named Margaret after Thomas's mother. She was small and perfect, with a strong cry that announced her presence to the world. Thomas held her awkwardly at first, cradling her in the crook of his left arm, terrified he would drop her, but she seemed content there, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb with surprising strength. As he looked down at her sleeping face, Thomas felt something shift inside him, a final letting go of the bitterness he had carried since losing his hand. This child would never know him as he had been. To her, he would simply be her father, complete as he was. She would not mourn what he lacked because she would never know anything different. Peter was 17 now, skilled enough to be considered a journeyman in his own right, though he chose to remain at the forge where he had learned his trade. Robert had married a widow from the village, a woman whose husband had died in the plague, and they were expecting their own child. The forge supported all of them adequately, not lavishly but comfortably, and the work continued to flow as the village rebuilt itself. One evening in late spring, Thomas stood outside the forge as the sun set, watching the sky turn from gold to amber to deep blue. Margaret was asleep in the house behind him, Agnes beside her. From the forge came the sound of Peter banking the coals for the night, the familiar scrape of shovel against stone, the soft hiss of settled ash. Thomas looked at his left hand, scarred and calloused, strong from years of work. He looked at the stump of his right arm, no longer a source of shame, but simply part of who he was. He thought of Edwin, buried in the churchyard, who had taught him not just the craft of blacksmithing, but the deeper lesson about respecting limits, about the cost of carelessness, about the price that iron sometimes demanded. The village had lost perhaps half its people to the plague. Thomas had lost his right hand to his own exhaustion and a moment's inattention. But somehow life continued, adapting, finding new forms, creating meaning from loss. The forge still burned. Iron was still shaped, tools were still made. And a new generation was learning the ancient craft, carrying it forward into an uncertain future. Thomas flexed his left hand, feeling the strength there, the capability. One hand, he had learned, was enough. Not for everything, not alone, but with help, with adaptation, with stubbornness and creativity and the support of others. It was enough. Winter would come again, as it always did. There would be cold mornings and difficult work, challenges and setbacks, perhaps more losses. But there would also be spring and summer, and the warmth of the forge, and the satisfaction of shaping raw metal into something useful and necessary. There would be Agnes and Margaret, and perhaps more children to come. There would be Peter and Robert and the community they served. The sky darkened to purple, the first stars emerging. From somewhere in the village came the sound of a dog barking, and farther away, the cry of a night bird. The familiar sounds of a world continuing, enduring, surviving. Thomas turned back toward his house, toward the warm light spilling from the doorway, toward his family waiting inside. His left hand reached for the door, pushed it open, and he stepped across the threshold into warmth and light, and the life he had built from the ashes of what he had lost. Behind him, the forge stood silent in the darkness, its coals banked but not dead, waiting for morning when they would be coaxed back to life, when the hammer would ring against the anvil once more, when iron would yield to fire and will and the persistent work of human hands. Even damaged hands, even frozen fingers that had learned too late the cost of working through cold and exhaustion. Even hands that no longer existed except in memory and phantom sensation. The work continued. The village endured. And Thomas, the one-handed blacksmith who had learned to teach others what he could no longer fully do himself, had found a way not just to survive but to build something meaningful from loss. As he closed the door behind him, shutting out the night, he heard Margaret stir and whimper. Agnes's soft voice soothed her, and the baby settled back into sleep. Thomas moved to stand beside them, looking down at his daughter's small, perfect hand, all 5 fingers intact, curled in sleep. "May you never know this kind of loss," he whispered, though he knew that life offered no such guarantees. Everyone lost something eventually. The question was not whether loss would come, but how one would respond when it did. He had his answer now, hard-won through months of pain and adaptation and slow healing. Loss could diminish or it could transform. The choice within limits was his to make. Thomas bent and kissed his daughter's forehead, then his wife's, then straightened and moved to stoke the fire in the hearth. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and in their light he could see his shadow, one-armed but whole, moving with purpose and certainty. Tomorrow he will return to the forge. Peter and Robert would arrive at dawn. There would be plows to sharpen, hinges to make, a broken wheel rim to repair. The work would continue because it had to, because the village needed them, because this was what he had chosen to become when the plague and the burn had taken away what he had been. Not just a blacksmith, but a teacher. Not just a craftsman, but a man who had learned that wholeness was not about having all one's parts intact, but about accepting what remained and using it fully. Not just a survivor, but someone who had transformed survival into something approaching grace. The fire crackled. His family slept peacefully, and outside, under the cold, distant stars, the medieval world turned through its ancient rhythms, indifferent to individual tragedies, grinding forward through plague and loss and endless winter toward springs that always, eventually, arrived. Thomas settled into his chair, his left hand resting on the arm, his stump no longer aching, and closed his eyes. Sleep would come soon, and with it rest, and after rest, another dawn, another day of work and adaptation, and small victories over the limitations that life had imposed. It was enough, he was enough. And in the morning, the forge would burn again. In medieval Europe, blacksmiths faced constant danger from burns, particularly during winter when cold hands responded slowly to danger. Many lost fingers, hands, or even their lives to molten metal and forge accidents. Yet the work continued, essential to community survival, passed from master to apprentice through generations. Their legacy lives on in every tool, every hinge, every piece of worked iron that connected medieval life together, crafted by hands that understood both the power of fire and the price it sometimes demanded. Rest well, dear friend. May your own hands remain safe and whole, And may you find, as Thomas did, that even our losses can be transformed into unexpected grace.